school report would be, has outstanding promise, but yet to deliver. I think 7 out of 10 so far, but it could go up to 9 out of 10 next year, I suspect, if things get delivered.
Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. I'm Lukas Degutis and this is our weekly omnibus. In case you've missed it, this week's cover is Trump Shock. Our US and Deputy Editor Freddy Gray asks whether there's method behind the president's apparent madness. Elsewhere in the magazine, Olivia Potts argues restaurant theft is out of control, while Ross Clark looks at the eco-fundamentalists driving themselves to extinction. And now that the White Lotus Season 3 has wrapped up, Tom Lee writes in defense of benzos. Before we begin, don't forget to browse our Spectator shop if you haven't already. You'll find very convenient links in the description below for things like our playing cards, puzzles, caps, gin, and much more. Now, the week. What will it take to see proper NHS reform? And after Health Secretary Wes Streeting announced NHS England will be dismantled, could he be the man to lead these reforms? Leading cancer specialist Karol Sikora joined our assistant editor Isabel Hardman to discuss.
So Karol, how do you feel Labour's reform on the NHS is progressing? They talked a lot about it in opposition. I personally thought they sounded quite impressive. Do you think that is being followed up with action?
I would agree with you, Isabel. I'm impressed by what's going on. I mean, you start off by first saying Wes Streeting said the system is broken and it has to be fixed. Now, the first problem in any practical solution is to admit there is a problem. If you don't admit there's a problem, you're never going to fix it. And what we saw for the last 14 years and before that was a sort of fudge and a sort of capitalization on our NHS, the British love of their healthcare system, which has been tarnished since COVID to a certain extent. And I think admitting it was the first thing you had to do. There is a problem, and that was done very quickly and very clearly.
Do you think that's the kind of thing only a Labour government can do, and that actually the genuflecting to the NHS and the pin badge wearing from Conservative MPs was something they felt they had to do just to get a hearing, whereas because Labour founded the NHS, because the Conservatives voted against the legislation enabling the NHS back in the 1940s, actually Labour is just able to steam ahead with the assumption that it does love the NHS and that changes it's making are for its good rather than because it has a secret privatisation agenda.
Well, I first started working in the NHS as a doctor over 50 years ago. I'm so old. And there's no doubt innovation in the NHS has come from the left rather than the right, because the right is too scared to use it. It's wrong that our healthcare system should be a political football. No other country in Europe uses it as such, but we do here. Left and right play with it. And you can see it ongoing now. And it's counterproductive. Healthcare is a transaction. Someone has to pay for it. Someone has to deliver it. How you do that, there's only 3 ways to pay: tax, insurance, and self-pay, credit cards and so on. There's no other way you can pay for it. There's no magic in it. And it's not a political issue. All healthcare systems in Europe are universal. In other words, everyone gets it somehow. Even the very poor get healthcare. Okay, it's not got the Rolls-Royce capacity if you're poor compared to rich, but you get something. And I think the problem for politicians is it's the most difficult part of politics to sort out how to deliver effective healthcare on a budget. This budget is always going to be limited. Rationing is always going to be there.
And yet the NHS budget is, vast in comparison to many other public service budgets. If we look at the way in which the Ministry of Justice and prisons budgets have been slashed over the past decade, if we look even at education and schools, for instance, the NHS always wins out in a battle with those services, even in a battle until recently with the armed forces. And so
Absolutely.
One of the arguments that is made, I think now across certainly the right to the centre left, is that the NHS gets a lot of money, but we don't necessarily see that much in return for it. Do you agree with that? And do you think that's something that Labour is able to tackle?
I think admitting it's wrong and then identifying what's wrong with it. And what's really impressed me, and these guys are only 6 months or a bit more in, they've essentially got rid of a whole layer of bureaucracy at the top, NHS England. It was introduced by Andrew Lansley a long time ago, 12 years ago, and it is clearly just a repetitive bureaucracy of very highly paid, self-serving people who were active once in healthcare, but have just got put in a fancy office. I've been there several times, Isabel, and it strikes me like a railway signal box. You have rows of offices with lots of levers. You're going to control the NHS, the railway lines of the NHS. But someone's disconnected the levers from the reality and not told these people. So they're writing memo. The chairman is about the quietest mouse I've ever heard. No one knows his name anywhere. And the chief executive who's been let go recently, I mean, I don't see what productivity that layer of bureaucracy was actually giving. And of course, for every executive, you have to have a secretary, you have to have a support staff, administrative staff, and it was very costly. So I think that's what Wes Streeting's done very quickly. What else is he going to do? That's the thing now. How are we really going to do it?
And it's really interesting you mentioned the departure of Amanda Pritchard, who, according to some accounts, left in part because she was concerned that Wes Streeting was trying to be more controlling of the health service. And you and I both know that the New Labour era saw big advances in the way in which the NHS was able to operate, NHS spending, the structure of the NHS. But I think you'd probably agree with me, Karol, that it also saw a huge amount of control freakery and that some of that was not healthy for the NHS, that it bled down from the sort of tough-talking political ranks through the management of the NHS, who were terrified of being phoned up on a Sunday night by some of the figures in the Department of Health, or indeed summoned to Alan Milburn's sofa on a Monday morning for a dressing down, that bled down then to the lower ranks, even right down to, you know, a band 4 nurse in A&E who was being shouted at because somebody had breached, for instance. So are you worried that one of the, I wouldn't even say unintended consequences, because we have seen this film before, one of the consequences of this removal of this layer of management within NHS England means that actually there's a tendency or possibly a potential for a huge amount of political control freakery to start all over again?
I think the problem within the system has been identified time and time again, and again by Wes Streeting, that there are certain functions that are very different. I mean, my function is cancer services, other people's maybe cardiac, others general practice, public health, and so on. But when you look at them, there are multiple professionals, health professionals taking part, but there's nobody really in charge of anything. And that's the fundamental difference between us and private sector corporations, for example, where someone's in charge. Whether you like them or not, whether they're doing the right thing or not is different, but they're in charge. And it's exactly like the captain of a ship or the captain of a plane. If there's an emergency, that one person takes control. Within the NHS, it's not clear who's in charge even still. And different functions may have different people. It doesn't have to be a doctor. It could be another health professional that's in charge, but someone has to take that responsibility. It's not just a grand title. And, you know, in the NHS, there are a lot of grand titles out there, advanced healthcare practitioner, all sorts of things. People have titles longer than the hours of the day on their emails when they send you, some people. And this is not what's important. It's delivering quality service. And it doesn't matter what it is. It could be, in my case, say radiotherapy or chemotherapy. In other places, it may be getting the queue down in the emergency room by really having fast-track triage. So why do people have to wait 4 hours? It's soluble. It's totally soluble if someone is put in charge to do that. And I guess within the NHS, salaries compared to everywhere else are relatively high. And if you factor in the pension that is so generous for people, it is quite highly paid. So in the private sector, you expect to have more incentivization, so you're paid by results, whereas we're not paid by results. And I think all these things in the modern world make it difficult.
And do you think that the reforms we've heard so far, and granted we haven't had the the 10-year NHS plan that's apparently resulted from this national conversation that ministers have been having, although I'd be interested to know in your views whether actually ministers have made up their minds before this consultation exercise had been made. But you think these changes are going to increase that accountability that does exist in the private sector and that does seem to be lacking in the NHS?
I think it does. You go on any website and it was a news website, and you see adverts for private medical insurance, everywhere you look on the web. And that's telling you something. It's telling you that people are not enamored with the quality of care they get. I've heard endless stories of people phoning up to get GP appointments at 8 o'clock in the morning. On my mobile phone, I can book airline tickets to New York in an hour's time. But can I book a GP appointment? Can I book a hospital appointment? Can I book a scan? Absolutely not. You can within the private sector, but not in the public sector. Now, everything's rationed, but even still, the NHS should become far more adapted to the modern information technology world. And the excuse that old people can't use it, they do use it to book airline tickets and holidays and cruises and so on. So for goodness sake, that's a lame excuse. And also the other thing that shows you the NHS can do things, it can do incredible things, is a reaction to COVID and the COVID vaccination program. I bet you, Isabel, on your phone, like me, have the batch numbers of all the vaccines, including the boosters that you had for COVID. That's still on my phone. I've got incredible detail about that. It created out of nothing. Within a month, the program was established. Places, sports clubs. I went to a sports club locally to have my booster, and it was really efficient. And coming from nothing. Why can't we have that same go-getting approach to delivery of GP care, for example?
Do you think, though, that the vaccine programme was so successful because there was so much focus on it at the expense of all the other functions of the NHS, and the NHS is having to now deal with the backlog that was caused by the prioritisation of the vaccine programme, by the closure of other NHS treatments while COVID was dominating the agenda, that actually perhaps it is good at delivering one thing when one thing is its focus, but a health service doesn't deliver one thing. And in normal times, which most of us hope to spend most of our time living in, that's much harder.
You're right. And I think the problem the NHS has is the aging population. My generation costs about 5 times to maintain per year than your generation. And that is really difficult. It's not just the cost, it's the time required. And not only that, within the older population, there are certain people that even Wes Streeting called them frequent flyers. We're not allowed to use those terms in the hospitals now. Gold card holders is the other, platinum card holders, people that require, for no particular reason, it's not that they've got diabetes or chronic kidney disease, but they just keep coming into hospital, spend few days, then going home, then coming in again. And there are social determinants there. On the whole, these people live in poorer quality housing, have poorer quality lifestyles, and have less money. And so you can identify them. Can we do something about them? Now, the interesting program that Wes Streeting announced just a few days ago was the idea of having a community set up where people go knocking on houses to see if you're ill. I don't think you're going to have brain surgeons going around knocking on people's houses. I don't think it'll work like that. And it's not really been clarified how it'll work. Who will actually knock on the doors of houses? It probably won't be a qualified person. It'll probably be a lay person, a volunteer or something like that. I mean, the difficulty is that all these things cost money, and all these things generate problems. They generate people that get labeled as ill, therefore have to be investigated. We've got to do something, because we're going to see more and more people over 80 consuming more and more healthcare. And these people are paying very little tax on the whole, because they're pensioners by definition. So your generation having to fund the payment for the older generation who are paying less tax but consuming more healthcare. And that's a real issue, how we solve that. Streeting can make the system more efficient, and that's what I'd really like to see.
I think one of the things that I'm still waiting for, really, is finding out how in practical terms, Streeting is going to realise his preventive agenda. He talked about that very eloquently in opposition, including in an interview with The Spectator when he was Shadow Health Secretary. And now they're in the position where they can actually start to realise that. And yet all the analysis, including from places like the Nuffield Trust, shows that the direction of travel for resources is still towards acute rather than away from acute and towards preventive. And it's almost as though Streeting has a map, he has his oil tanker, he knows where he wants the oil tanker to go, but he has no idea yet, or he hasn't told us, how he's going to turn that tanker around. And it's not the first time we have heard a health secretary talking about the need to move towards more preventive care, to get people earlier in their treatment journey, as people like to describe it. So how much confidence do you have that the NHS will start to see people sooner, that perhaps it may actually see them before they develop cancer, that, related to obesity, for instance, and other lifestyle factors?
I think technology is on the side of this. That's the good thing about it. What's going to happen, predictive medicine will be able to, using the understanding the molecular composition of various things, blood cells, components in the blood, predict who's going to get what in the future. And once you can start doing that, you can really have effective prevention, because just telling everybody not to smoke is a message that obviously is good, don't smoke. But if you could select those that are really likely to get lung cancer if they smoke, they'd be more powerfully motivated to not smoke. And of course, you can apply that to obesity, you can apply it to the way in which we eat food and diet and exercise. So I think once you can predict what's going to happen to an individual more accurately, it means that you can screen those that are more at risk and leave those that are less alone. So it becomes much more efficient and much more cost effective for the system. So it's all about keeping people living well for a longer period of time and having what's called the healthcare trajectory goes on, live long and healthily. And then when you do come to the end, because everyone has to go, we're not going to fight death. You go relatively slowly, relatively quickly, and you don't linger on in a sort of hinterland. And that would be what good health looks like in the future, I think. And as we keep coming back to it, it's not a political issue. You have to have a health minister that's smart. And Wes, he went to Cambridge, so he must be smart, because I went to Cambridge. But no, he does seem quite smart. Some of them, and I've met probably about 10 health ministers in my time, were not very smart. I won't say who they were. But and as you say, the Conservative ministers all wore more obvious badges of this supporting the NHS, because they have to show they're not going to privatize it or convert it to a massive insurance system. And not that they ever planned to, I don't think, but they had to show they were part of the religion in the aisles of the church of the NHS.
Now, finally, how much of any of this reform is possible when the government has been very clear that it's not going to enact meaningful long-term reform of social care until a second parliament of a Labour government?
That is, I just find it appalling, really, because that's the problem. That is the fundamental problem of all sorts of things, from GP appointments to hospital delays in admissions to waiting times for cold operations, because the system's not separated. If a hospital's flooded by a load of people that really need social care, that have nowhere to go when they get discharged from hospital, everything clues up. The whole system just clogs up like a pipe that's furred in a central heating system. And I think if you look at how it works in practice, care homes, all private sector, as soon as someone gets ill in a care home, the standard protocol, dial 999, ambulance comes, takes them to the emergency room. People often they've just sort of maybe got a bit dizzy, maybe had a small fall. They go immediately to hospital, they're admitted. If they can't go home, they can't go back to the care home, they're in the bed. And they're the guys we call them bed blockers. Again, we're not allowed to call that now. It's a derogatory term. So we've been educated not to, but that's what it is. They're blocking the bed. And that means the cancer patient waiting for his operation for colon cancer can't get in because the bed's full. And it's all at short notice. The patient who's going to have a major cancer operation is phoned on the day of the operation to be told, sorry, it's been cancelled, we haven't got a bed. And this happens up and down the country, and it's no way to run a system. So social care is the key to stop the bed blocking. We find ways to put people. I think the last estimate is some 25% of patients in hospital today in the UK, in the NHS, don't need to be there, but they can't get out because there's nowhere to put them that's safe for them. And obviously patient safety is important, but do we really want to? Hospital beds are expensive, and old people don't want to be in hospital. They want to be at home or in a nicer environment. So these are the problems for the whole of society. So I was so disappointed when I saw it was put back to 2028. It seemed too long.
And so overall, marks out of 10 for their first few months in office on the NHS?
I think promising. A school report would be, has outstanding promise, but yet to deliver. I think 7 out of 10 so far, but it could go up to 9 out of 10 next year, I suspect, if things get delivered.
The Prime Minister Keir Starmer announced this week that a Labour government would delay the UK's 2030 ban on the sale of new petrol and diesel cars, citing concerns about cost, public buy-in and infrastructure readiness. In the summer of 2024, Rory Sutherland offered his timely take on EV mandates. Was he correct?
The extent to which, in some cases, I mean, broadly speaking, as I say, I support electrification as a direction of travel. I support renewable energy in terms of a direction of travel. But I think we have a kind of precedent in the case of mandated fluorescent bulbs, the way in which we got rid of the incandescent bulb. And we got rid of it about 2 years too early because we mandated that everybody bought these piece of crap bulbs that took 10 minutes to reach full brightness. Okay. And then 2 years later, LED lighting came along, which rendered the whole thing completely moot. And I think I'm very uncomfortable with mandated timescales that are universally applied. I think as far as possible, I would encourage people whose motoring requirements are, within normal range and who have their own driveway. I would encourage those people to at least consider an electric car because I think they're very, very good. I mean, looked at from the point of view of an alien, the internal combustion engine is an insanely complicated mechanism for simply rotating a shaft. Okay, all those parts, the air filter, the oil filter, the tappets, the big end, the cylinders, the gearbox, okay, all of those things are eliminated in an electric car. It's electricity in, rotation out. Okay, so there's a very good reason why your toothbrush, I assume you have an electric toothbrush, doesn't run on an internal combustion engine. There's a very good reason why radio-controlled helicopters, in my childhood, they ran on tiny little sort of one-stroke or two-stroke engines. Okay, they don't anymore. Okay, the movement of travel should be electric, and the government should at the very least, kind of encourage that. And I might also add that people go, it's disgusting that my taxes went to subsidising you having a new electric car. Can I make the point that anybody who buys a car from new is practicing a massive form of wealth redistribution through voluntary means? If you go and buy a new Jag, Freddie, what it means is that 4 years later, someone will be able to buy a really, really good car for half the price you paid. If only the property market worked like that. I've got this 3-bedroom house in Mayfair, but I've used it for 3 years, so you can have it for half price. Okay, you are a massively generous social person because it means that someone half as wealthy as you can have a car that's nearly as good as yours.
Rory, let me interrupt. Isn't the key word voluntary there?
Yes, absolutely. I don't think it's wrong in the early days of a technology for a government to at least make sure that I was very much in favour of a light touch on vaping. Because I think, in the early days of a technology, the natural reaction is kind of fear and hostility. It's worth noting, by the way, I'm old enough to remember in 1989, I used a mobile phone on Oxford Street and 2 people shouted abuse at me from passing cars. Okay, right. Most technologies encounter quite a lot of hostility in their early days, sometimes deservedly, sometimes not.
You touched on a what could be the key point here, which is that innovation always comes up with something unexpected that government action hasn't provided for and that markets can provide for. And that might be, in the case of cars, self-driving cars, which might come along just at the moment as the EV market is ready to go. And in fact, will replace it entirely.
Or actually, mini cars. Somewhere between the electric cargo bike and the car, there is the opportunity for an electric car which people use for short-range journeys. It's kind of absurd. I take a four-seater car to my local station 3 miles away with a bloody great battery weighing a ton, okay? To be honest, for that journey, what I need is some sort of micro vehicle.
Yes.
Okay. The Citroen Ami isn't a totally insane idea. It's probably a bit ahead of its time, but I can see the micro car being quite a major solution here because they don't need very big batteries. They don't need huge range. In fact, in the case of the Citroen Ami, you just plug it into a 3-pin socket. You don't even need a charger. But I agree with you that I think that the attempt to take a kind of theoretical ideal, set a timeline for it, and impose it on the market without allowing the market to do its ingenious best. And we have, exactly the case of those, fluorescent light bulbs, which were ghastly, There's also a problem, by the way, which is a psychological one. I mentioned the fact that not many people buy new cars. Okay, it's a narrow slice of the market that buys cars from new, and they tend to be much, much older and therefore potentially more conservative. Who knows? Okay, less experimental. There's also the problem that 25 years of experience, if you are over 50, actually 50 years of experience, has taught you that with electrical goods, it always pays to wait. Okay, the people who bought the first flat screen televisions paid an insane premium for a not particularly good plasma screen. LCD came along, changes the game. I think there's potential for a similar game-changing invention in electric locomotion, to be honest. But you're right in the sense that a lot of people have this instinctive feeling if it's got a plug of some kind, okay, and it's relatively new, the trick is to wait 5 years. Until the problems have been ironed out or human ingenuity has had the opportunity to do its best.
Well, and a problem that a lot of people want to get ironed out is batteries, which, as Ross says towards the end of his piece, they're all. China seems to have cornered the market to a large extent. British attempts to develop our own battery market have been pretty unsuccessful for electric cars. And until this gets ironed out or becomes a more competitive market by itself, the EV market is going to struggle. The bigger EV market is going to struggle.
Yes, I mean, again, one of the things I think that's often true in terms of migrating people, there's a concept in design called MAYA, which is maximally advanced yet acceptable. And it comes from Raymond Loewy, the designer, who said that it's your job to produce something that's notably better than what preceded it, but not so weirdly different that people find it unrecognizable or alarming or simply can't make sense of it. I don't understand the antipathy to plug-in hybrids, which seem to me a pretty good compromise, okay? Most of your journeys, if you do plug them in, are going to be electric with all the benefits that brings. One thing with my electric car, I very rarely use the brakes at all. Okay, I took my car in for a service and they said the brakes are fine and the tires are fine. I said, what about all the other stuff? They said, there isn't any other stuff. Okay, there are huge advantages to this. But actually, the plug-in hybrid seems to me actually a pretty healthy compromise if someone reduces not 100% of their carbon emissions. And I don't think this is all about carbon, by the way, anyway. Okay. But if someone reduces a very large part of their carbon emissions, but still has an electric, an internal combustion engine for longer range journeys, and therefore has a lighter, smaller battery, that doesn't strike me. That doesn't strike me as anything insane about this. It's very similar to the argument about heat pumps, where to get a grant for a heat pump, you have to rip out your whole boiler and your central heating system. Okay, well, I'd like to keep them in reserve, if you don't mind. I'm quite happy getting a heat pump which maybe reduces my use of gas by 80%. I'm not going to get rid of my boiler just yet, if you don't mind. That's kind of a leap in the dark. And interestingly, if you want to know a very interesting thing about heat pumps, an air conditioning unit, which you can install one room at a time for about £1,500, which is a very, very long established technology made by recognizable companies like, Mitsubishi and so forth. That's a heat pump. You can install an air conditioning unit and run it in reverse. It has basically the same level of efficiency. It's an air-to-air heat pump. And you can keep your boiler for really, really cold spells. Why don't you get a grant for that? And I asked my brother, he's doing this whole air conditioning thing. He's an astrophysicist, so he knows all the bloody mathematics and the physics involved, okay? And he said, it's very simple. They don't want people installing air conditioning units because you might use them for air conditioning, okay, which would then increase energy consumption. To which my answer is, mate, this is the UK, okay? That's a reasonable, I think, objection to air conditioning units if you're in Algeria or if you're in southern Italy or if you're in Greece. In the UK, a lot of happy people would enjoy air conditioning for the 2 weeks of the year when it's painfully hot, and then have a heat pump for the rest of the year. They could still keep their boiler, which they'd use if it were just egregiously cold for a couple of weeks. I think that's a happy compromise many people could adopt, which is MEA, maximally advanced yet acceptable. It's what an evolutionary biologist, as I said in this week's article, would call the adjacent possible. You can get people to do that. The number of people who'll spend £40,000 in one go ripping out their boiler and their radiators, digging up their lawn to install piping, the number of people who'll do that rather than, say, having a holiday in the Maldives with the available money is very, very small, and they're probably enormously rich to begin with. So why the hell are we subsidising them?
Well, quite. Rory, I'm afraid I'm going to have to unplug you there because we're running out of time. But thank you very much indeed. It's always fascinating to talk to you about any subject, and particularly one as curious as this. Thank you, Rory.
The US are now levying tariffs on China at 125%. China says Trump's trade war will, quote, end in failure. Could they be right? Economist Diana Choyleva joined our assistant editor Cindy Yu to assess whether this is the beginning of a trade war we've not witnessed before.
Diana, first of all, just help us make sense of everything that's happened recently. What the hell is going on? Did you see Trump's 90-day reprieve coming?
Look, what is happening, cutting through all the noise and high frequency movements and volatility, the world is really going crazy. But essentially what's happening is the bifurcation of the world into a US-led and China-led sphere of influence. This has been going on for some time, but now it's accelerating at an extremely fast pace. And each country will need to choose whether they are with the US or with China.
Mm-hmm. But when it seemed like Trump was levying a tariff, a reciprocal tariff, as he called it, on basically all of the world, it made it a bit easier for those countries to say, well, maybe we should be starting to side with China a bit more. But now that has been pushed back for 90 days. That changes the landscape, doesn't it? Does Trump really mean what he's talking about?
So there are two objectives for Trump, and in a way they are kind of conflicting in the way he goes about them. There is a genuine desire to reindustrialize the US, to actually in some ways shrink its sphere of influence and focus on not being the global policeman that we have all become used to over the last 80 years, but really within China's US's more direct geographical location, as well as the Indo-Pacific, and to some extent kind of leave Russia and its kind of immediate sphere of influence without necessarily a very heavy US involvement. So there is a kind of an overall geopolitical element to this. And then reindustrializing the US in terms of bringing manufacturing back. Now, that the Trump administration had a long-term plan, had something that looked a bit more thought out. But that went in conflict with Trump's erratic behavior of trying to use basically the tariffs as a negotiating tool for short-term issues that the US is trying to, with each country, different issues, negotiate. And that created this extremely volatile and uncertain environment for business, which is actually going against their long-term strategy of reindustrializing America and trying to bring as many of those countries that they want to have in their sphere of influence to their sphere of influence. Now, China is not playing ball. they essentially have sort of responded with, okay, bring it on. And they've had 10 years to prepare. They are concluding that with this type of administration, and just generally, to be honest, irrespective of the administration, it's now impossible to reach any grand bargain. That ideologically between the two is impossible, to be honest. So they are not, they've changed completely the way they're dealing with the US. In the first Trump administration, it was a lot about essentially trying to appease America, trying to see if, they can still deal with them. Now they've given up on that and they're focused entirely on bringing Asia, and they see a big opportunity now in Europe to its sphere of influence. So Trump rode back because all of a sudden, really, he's focusing strategically on China as the main issue, even though realistically he has a gripe with everyone in terms of various barriers. It's not really reciprocal tariffs. I'm not going to repeat all this assessment that everyone's talked about. But the bit which is quite also China related is, of course, all these other countries that China has used in the last 10 years to route its exports to the US through. So then they, of course, America definitely wants to close that. So when they're talking about negotiating with, let's say, for example, the UK versus negotiating with a place like Vietnam, the choices that Vietnam will have to make are very, very stark. Whereas in the UK, of course, that hasn't really been used as a route for Chinese exports into the US.
So some of this global tariffs is to close off those loopholes that China has used since. But as you say, in the last 10 years, since the first trade war, China has diversified away from the US. I think imports from the US are down as a proportion of its imports. Exports are down as a proportion of its exports. We hear about this dual circulation, that the Chinese economy is becoming more self-reliant. But do you think, despite all of this, it has a stomach for a fight like this? I mean, we're talking about 125% tariffs here now.
Well, it's not going to be a walk in the park, but actually, strategically, China is in a better position here. The first thing is the political cycle, and of course, the nature of government. Xi Jinping, in charge of the Chinese Communist Party, can withstand a much longer period of economic pain without having to change course, in particular because he now easily can blame the US for where we are. And already having taken this very strong stance of we'll fight until the end, it's extremely impossible to kind of reverse in any significant way. Whereas in the US, they will have, or Trump will have to face off with first the consumers and the electorate that he promised lower inflation. That's not coming. Even the composition of what sort of China imports and exports to the US suggests that it's the US consumer that will carry a lot of the inflationary burden. And it's not just a one-off price adjustment with adding the tariffs, because supply chains will be rerouting, breaking up, etc. This is a multi-year period of cost push inflation. And even from a policy perspective, China can have a coordinated monetary and fiscal policy response, whereas the US, however much I'm sure Trump will try, does not necessarily hold the cards when it comes to monetary policy and the Fed. So the ability of the US policymakers to respond to this emergency situation, outside of the issue of how sort of disorganized and last minute the administration seems to be in what's going on right now, they are in a much weaker position. So strategically, and actually there is another point as well, America will have to deal with a stagflationary environment, which is harder to resolve than what China is having to deal with, which is a deflationary environment, where it's a lot easier to pump with liquidity. And simultaneously as well, the Chinese do have still a lot of fiscal scope to mop up and cover what is actually a very significant bad debt problem in China and an issue of overinvestment, etc., etc. So this is definitely not a walk in the park, but Beijing has concluded, evidently, that there is no other way but to stand up to America. They have prepared, and they are banking on the fact that ultimately the economy, the markets, and eventually the electorate in the US, including, a lot of the wealthier Republican donors that have supported Trump's agenda, will put pressure on Donald Trump himself. In fact, Donald Trump said also that he's prepared to talk on company by company basis, which also allows for sort of a roll back and step down without necessarily losing face.
And presumably what's happened in the last 24 hours, China will also see as the fact that Trump has been made to step back a little bit by the markets.
Well, it's interesting. I think on both sides don't know each other as well. They have less and less communication. There is a huge gap and a problem there. And I do think one of the major issues is the fact that they don't really understand each other. They cannot judge necessarily what is a real signal, which creates a very volatile environment. And I came back a week ago from the Boao Forum in Beijing, and it was the Boao Forum for Asia. And it was really striking. There was a panel on globalization with representatives from most of Asia, also America as well. And really the conversation kept moving to the regionalization concept and further discussions of how they'll integrate further. And the US representative sort of kept saying, but the US, and he was quite critical of Trump, but he was getting zero basically attention, and not sort of in a staged way, but really, we're really not interested. So, well, you can't forget the biggest economy in the world. It's like, well, they were so this really, there is a real shift in China as to what they can reasonably expect from any dealings with the US. And to be fair to Trump, actually, China started this decoupling before even Trump turned up the tariff war, because China started with Made in China 2025 and pursuing this agenda of writing up the value-added chain and making its economy self-sufficient. So this has been really going on ever since Xi Jinping came to power, and then accelerated during the first Trump presidency. And now it's reaching its crescendo moment.
Yeah, and that's really interesting because the regionalization point is definitely what I'm picking up from Chinese media as well. I think that People's Daily ran an editorial a few days ago where, one of the reasons it said that China can afford to have this fight was because look at the percentage of our trade with ASEAN countries, look at the percentage of our trade with Belt and Road countries. We simply don't need American trade anymore. And whether that's true or not, that it was definitely one of the top reasons that they gave. But Diana, what you're saying that China can stomach this fight, it can be controversial to some amongst economists. I think there's a really fierce debate going on here. Often people say China is the major exporting power. It just has less room to tariff American imports because it just imports less from America in any kind of tariff tit-for-tat game. So why do you think those economists get that wrong then, if you think that China actually has more capability to weather this fight than they think?
So, I've been analyzing China, as you know, for more than 25 years. And in my time, I've never been afraid to raise my head above the parapet when I have a strong conviction. And more often than not, I get things right. Whether that will be the case this time or not, we'll have to see. But I think what's happening is that there has been a very fundamental shift in policy when it comes to the economy, which started in September last year. And it's crucial to all this, because what China needs is less so export markets, but to really finally get its domestic demand, in particular consumption, going. And for a long time, they really ignored that side of the economy. In fact, financially repressed households, etc., etc. And a lot of the economists in the West, in particular, and as you know, I'm also a senior fellow at the Egg Society in Washington. I'm quite well acquainted with the Western view of China. And, really, to my mind, they sort of missed what an important turning point this focus on consumption has been since September. China always before looked at it from the supply side, and this time they really are looking at it properly from getting the demand and the consumer side going. And of course, that is also a Herculean task, and they're not necessarily doing all the right things, but they're doing a lot of positive changes that also may take time to come through, but to create a vibrant consumption that goes up as a share of GDP and then serves as the consumer of a final resort for China's sphere of influence. And in fact, China is quite interested in outsourcing, especially the low value added manufacturing to other countries, and then, of course, importing back the goods, the consumer goods that they will need as well. So it is that I think it's this that differs. That my assessment is that they're serious about consumption and they're throwing everything at it now.
And could you just elaborate on how that relates to the tariffs then?
It relates to the tariffs in that if they manage to get the 1.4 billion Chinese to consume, and if you look at the consumption rate as a share of GDP relative to some place like America or the UK, it's half that. So there's a huge structural scope for growth if they manage to get the consumer going. And then that will be very attractive as well for their trading partners, because one of the key issues with China is the worry that, okay, well, we join your sphere of influence and all you're going to do is dump your exports onto us. Really, the rest of the world needs a consumer base, not, we can't all export our way to grow.
That's really fascinating. So as the US tries to become less of a world consumer, China is trying to become more of one.
I'm not sure the US is necessarily trying to become less of a consumer, but China has a huge scope to do so, whereas the US is already consuming quite a large share of GDP.
And how successful can the party be at doing that? Because famously, Chinese consumers and Chinese households in general save a high proportion of their income. They don't tend to consume, they don't tend to borrow to consume. And that has been a cultural as well as a structural issue. Not least to mention as well the relative lack of confidence since coming out of COVID. How successful can that shift be?
You're absolutely right. That is structural and cyclical reasons. And the structural reasons have been there for a long time. Over the past 15 years, one structural reason kind of fell away, and that was due to the worsening demographics, because all of a sudden China's vast pool of labor wasn't as vast and not as cheap, and the labor force started shrinking. So the share of wages in GDP in China is the same as in America. They actually did catch up on that front. But the huge difference in income, for total household income as a share of GDP in China, is in income from assets versus the US. So the government has been pushing in that direction. How do they change the financial repression of households? The majority of wealth has been in the housing market, and the houses are for living in, not for speculation. Let's have no house price inflation. Has really severely damaged confidence, partly together with the COVID shock, where people under 40 for the first time experienced what going backwards in authoritarianism can mean. That has really dampened confidence. But now in September, houses are for living in, not for speculation, went out of the window. And this is really, China is really actually trying to revive the housing market. Again, various issues there. Also, they are trying to turn their equity market, which has never had any correlation really with growth and has been a speculative casino-like place where people don't put money for the long term, into a professionalized capital markets where Chinese can invest their money and stay for the long term, as well as get higher dividends. A lot of household financial wealth sits in interest-bearing deposits that have been going down, and why we have been also saying that it's unlikely that they will kind of really push interest rates down drastically, not least because the banking sector is under tremendous pressure, but also because that negatively hurts households, and the gearing is quite large. It's about 1.5 times interest income. So Chinese households are very large net savers. So these are the structural shifts. There is a lot to do with lowering cost in terms of education, et cetera, et cetera. The cultural aspects will be the most difficult to shift. Mm-hmm. And you can probably talk more about, from a genuine cultural perspective about that than me. But I think one of the biggest issues is the fact that really China has always, in the last 100 years, had so much drastic change that this is really innate. You notice it in the Chinese diaspora in other countries with, where all the other reasons why the Chinese saves are not there, they still save these diasporas more than the local population because of this innate expectation that things can just change dramatically. And COVID was the first time that such a change appeared in the minds of all these people before 40. And so that will be the most difficult to shift. But the other structural reasons in terms of more income flowing to households are not, they're down to policy.
Yeah, and so they can be manipulated. So, Diana, taking a step back then, how optimistic are you for the Chinese economy in this year and next year?
It's going to be a huge hit, however we cut the cake. But I am not as pessimistic as it seems to be US policymakers are in their expectation of what China can achieve or what they can reasonably manage to withstand over the course of this year.
And very finally, Diana, I'm sorry to ask you this because it's such a fast-moving situation, but do you have any sense of where this goes next? How bad can it get? How long will it last? Or are we just utterly in uncharted territory right now?
We are definitely in uncharted territory, but what I can tell you is that this is going to get worse and it's not going to go away. There is no way this is going away. This is now, we are in the eye of the storm of how I started our conversation today, the bifurcation, the great decoupling. As you know, we were the first to kind of alert and analyze since 2017 and call it the great decoupling theme. And it includes the trade war, anything to do with the economy. There's capital markets, which is a different story, the tech war, which is ongoing, and of course, Taiwan war and where we get to on that front. So really, we've just pressed on the accelerator of this bifurcation, this decoupling, this fundamental reworking of the global order. And it will certainly provide us with many opportunities to talk about how things are going.
This year, the parent blog, Mumsnet, celebrates its 25th anniversary. To discuss its political rise, Natasha Feroze spoke to journalist Helen Joyce and author of the book Politicization of Mumsnet, Sarah Pedersen.
I have to say, I didn't quite realise how embedded it has been into British politics over the last couple of decades. Difficult question, it was very open, but just to start with, could you explain what a role it's had?
Oh, it's had a massive role. I think the 2012 general election was actually known as the Mumsnet election because so many politicians from practically every party, including Nigel Farage, went onto Mumsnet and did a chat and tried to persuade the users of Mumsnet to vote for them. What you need to understand is that middle-class women tend to be floating voters, and they tend to make up their mind very, very late, just before they go into the polls. And so 2012, there was a real attempt to seize these women for what was the youthful David Cameron, who was leading a a reimagined Conservative Party, the compassionate, caring Conservative Party. And he really went on there, sold himself as a young father, and really performed quite well, actually. But yeah, 2012 was a big time. And politicians have been going on there really ever since. If there is a family related policy, you will find a minister going on there to try and sell it to Mumsnetters.
And did you get, I picked up on this in your book, obviously you say that they're floating voters, but values-wise and policy-wise, are there any key themes with Mumsnetters?
Yes, I mean, although I say they're floating voters, I think the majority probably would feel that they're on the left wing, somewhere on the left wing. But one of the key things that we probably will be talking about is that a very large proportion of Mumsnetters, particularly those who use the feminism talk boards, are gender critical. And so that over the last 10 years now has meant that their vote has been moving around dependent on what the parties will promise on that particular topic.
Helen, nice point to
nice
bring
segue.
You in. When you've obviously been campaigning in this critical, gender critical space for a very long time, was Mumsnet, to quote, safe space for you in at that time in the early years?
So I didn't join Mumsnet until I think, I was trying to remember when, my older child was born in 2002, but it wasn't for a long time after that because I'm actually from a very big family and, I'm the eldest of a very large family. So I didn't turn to somewhere online to find out about these extraordinary little creatures that I didn't know anything about. And then I joined sometime maybe 2015 or 2016. I've actually never posted on Mumsnet. I've only ever lurked, which I think a lot of people do. And, it was the feminism boards, but in particular, there are some very, very, very funny things on Mumsnet. If you haven't used it, you won't know that in some ways it's quite user unfriendly and that it was quite an early platform and they never went for the whole updating and trying to make it very addictive the way that, TikTok and Tumblr and X are. So it's quite text-based, but in some ways that encourages people to get quite persona driven and to get into longish and sometimes very entertaining conversations on random things. Women, men can join, and there are men who go on Mumsnet, but it is mostly women, and it's women talking about women's lives without worrying about, being, let's say, palatable. So I never really got into it for the gender critical stuff, funnily. It was a different reason that I got into that. I was commissioned to write about it. And I found Sarah because a friend said to me, Mumsnet's the only place where women are able to speak freely about this. They did have some speech rules. They did say that you couldn't misgender, you couldn't use phrases like trans-identifying male, but they were literally the only place online for several years that women weren't kicked off if they didn't call men who identify as women, if they didn't use preferred pronouns. So I think they did an amazing job there. And, what I came to believe when I wrote my book was that Mumsnet was a huge factor in why the UK is where gender critical women have made most headway. And so I interviewed Sarah for my book actually about that, and she features and her book features and Mumsnet features. But yeah, penis speaker is what Mumsnet really means to me.
What's really important about Mumsnet, as far as that conversation is concerned, is that people use pen names, very witty pen names sometimes. But I think we mustn't underestimate the importance of being able to make a statement, whether it's about being gender critical or whether it's to come and seek help about domestic abuse, which you also get women doing, or just to make a funny comment about a television series. But the fact that you're using a pen name means that no one knows it's you. And things like Facebook or to a certain extent Twitter, that's not true. And Mumsnet gives us a really safe space for women to actually express their opinions about things like feminist issues or politics without anybody knowing it's them. And that's really, really important.
Sarah, there's something very British about Mumsnet, and you mentioned this in your book that you don't find an equivalent in America and you don't find an equivalent in Australia. What is it about the Britishness of the blog? Sort of the thing that jumped out to me is what Helen said about it. the formatting being very plain. They haven't tried to glamorize anything, and maybe also, like you said, people using pen names, so they kind of get to hide behind, and actually in real life when they're saying their views, they're much more polite.
I think the Britishness is really important. I actually won a grant once to go to Australia to find the Australian Mumsnet and couldn't find it, which was a bit embarrassing. But no, it is British, but actually women from all over the world contribute to Mumsnet. And you really saw that during COVID. You saw women from Italy and France sharing their experiences with their sisters. And it's very much almost like a 70s consciousness raising group in some ways. It's this place where women can go and feel very safe and secure. But also it's small enough because we've got the same kind of cultural values. We can make the same joke about EastEnders and people will get it. So I think that's really important, that it's a safe space, but it's a culture we all share.
Helen, I just want to pick up on something you said in your previous answer, that men can be on Mumsnet. I haven't thought about it too much, but my gut reaction is that no, they probably can't. Do you not have a no men allowed rule?
They don't. And, men do need sometimes to get information about kids. Anyone can. There's nothing stopping anyone. Like on the internet, no one knows you're a dog, as they say, so who knows who anybody is. Mostly it isn't men. And I think that was incredibly important for the freedom to speak that Sarah talks about. It's not just about anonymity. It's that perennially mothers are underestimated. People like to say that something is mumsy is to say that it is trivial, superficial, uncool. There's a saying somebody told me once when I was younger, and it's often resonated, although my children are great, which is a mother's place is in the wrong. So men mostly don't go there. And if they do, they're going because they want to find out something. They need to know something. Like it might be a single dad, or it might be a dad who, is trying to get help with a specific issue and thinks it's a good place for it. What you don't get is tech bros. So it's a rare online space that isn't dominated by men who are, let us say, condescending towards women and have political opinions, whether they're right or left, that are kind of contemptuous towards women. So, I spend a lot of time on Twitter/X, and I'm happy enough there. But the fact is that there's a lot of men there who do like trolling women, who are extremely rude to women, who harass women, who send them dick pics and, DMs and that sort of thing. And Mumsnet was a place that you and it is still a place you just really don't expect that. Those men don't go there. And, and so many women who are on Mumsnet, mothers are just women who have babies, and they are graduates, they are professionals, they are lawyers, they're whatever. And when they're on maternity leave, no matter how much they like it and how much they like their babies, they're often bored witless. So they're women who are trying to use their brains, and they go on there and, they're witty, they're clever, they're sharing knowledge about loads of things that isn't just babies by any means. And by the way, babies is a good topic. So it's just a very, very, very different online space. And I don't know how much of that was by design, but that's why it's ended up being this place that's a huge powerhouse for women to support each other, and not just left-wing women by any means, but also to speak freely.
Yeah, it's about the only space that's completely dominated by women. Between 1% and 4% of regular users are male, so it's a really small percentage. If you look at Wikipedia, about 20% of the writers in Wikipedia are female, and about 20% of the biographies are female. Because you can see that's an incredibly dominated male space. Mumsnet is about the only place I can think of which is so dominated by women.
I have I wanted to read the first line of your book, Sarah, because I did find it very funny. Contrary to popular opinion amongst some sections of Twitter, women do not lose the ability to think once they have a baby. And did you find when you were writing this book that people have often underestimated the power of Mumsnet? Because there's a slight contradiction in that politicians have been quite opportunist in trying to harness the mum's vote through Mumsnet.
Mumsnet is incredibly powerful. It's powerful in a word of mouth kind of way. At one point, somebody came on and said, "Oh, this baby's bottom butter that's really cheap in Asda," or wherever it was. I've been using it on my face and it's absolutely fantastic. And within 24 hours, the country sold out of this stuff. So it's really influential just in little things like that, which is, of course, why the politicians go on there, because they think, well, if it's that influential, maybe I can persuade people to vote for me. But Mumsnet also does these enormous campaigns that actually pay off. So I think it was 2011, they did a campaign about miscarriage care. And this campaign came from users, and the users were talking about the way in which that if you miscarried at that time in an NHS hospital, you would be put into a ward with mothers and babies, thus doubling the distress that you were feeling. And so Mumsnet ran this enormous campaign, and of course, being very influential at the time with the general election coming up, asking for things to be changed. And the NHS changed its guidelines about miscarriage care. So it's really influential, and it runs campaigns, but the campaigns come from the discussion boards.
And I think I read somewhere that they're very specific with who can advertise with them. So they refused to allow Nestle to advertise on Mumsnet based off of them over. Maybe you can fill in the gaps. It was to do with the baby milk campaign.
Yeah. It's the marketing of baby milk out with UK, especially in Africa, and so they don't take adverts from that, and I believe at least they didn't take adverts from McDonald's. So they are very, very careful about that. Having said that, of course, as the site became more gender critical, it also really got hit by advertisers pulling out. There were demands around sort of 2019, 2020. A lot of pressure was put on Mumsnet because it was allowing this freedom of speech, because it was allowing gender critical discussion. You started to have advertisers pull out.
And Helen, do you think it was the CEO, Justine Roberts, who has basically led the charge on how Mumsnet is designed, and especially with the resistance in the gender critical stuff? Or do you think maybe it's the mums themselves? It seems like a very democratic platform.
I mean, I don't know Justine personally. I have talked to her, and she invited me on for a book launch, like a live book launch during lockdown, shortly after my book came out. So I don't feel I can answer really for her. But what I can say is that she clearly has a spine. 2019, 2020 was exactly when a lot of people who really do know a lot better decided that any woman who expressed the slightest concerns about the idea that men can be women, like that those women were basically fascists. And she just didn't take it. And then she set a rule that made nobody happy, which was that you weren't allowed to use what either side thought of as a slur. You weren't allowed to call women cis. You weren't allowed, like CIS, which is meant to be the opposite of trans. But you also weren't allowed to just misgender and, call trans women men, which has become very common now on Twitter since Elon Musk took it over. But at the time, that was enough, that it meant that you could have conversations. And then she stuck with that while people were pulling out advertising, but also talking about her and talking about Mumsnet as if, honestly, as if they were all going to start marching in goose step or something at this point. It was absolutely extraordinary. If you weren't there to watch it, and by this time I was alert, I was expecting her to fold, I have to say. And she didn't. And I think, why would that be? She must have a spine personally, but also, Sarah's description of how it runs, it was, democratic's maybe not the right word because it's not about voting or anything like that. It's about really understanding her users, understanding her demographic, listening to them, letting them lead. And I just think it's a really impressive model that I can't think of anything exactly like it anywhere else in either real life or online.
Justine Roberts at the time, I think still is, the only UK person to be a victim of swatting. So swatting is where it's a very American thing, and it's where somebody rings the police and says there's an armed man in the house, and they gave Justine Roberts' address. And the armed police then arrived at the address, and I believe her husband was like taking the bin out or something. And she's the only person that's ever happened to in the UK. So she was putting not just her livelihood online.
It's extraordinary. I just want to ask you, lastly, Sarah and Helen, if you have any ideas as well. Which were the most successful politicians with Mumsnet, and which were the least successful politicians?
It's really interesting, but female politicians have gone down very badly on Mumsnet. The question from about 2016, 2017 has been, can you define a woman? And you've seen very, very successful politicians really, really come down badly, refuse to respond, try and sort of push the question away, and that's gone down badly. I hate to say it, Boris Johnson performed incredibly well. But, you know, I think that there's been a whole variety of politicians who have performed well by taking Mumsnet as seriously. If you just go on there with the name of your favourite biscuit, it's going to go really badly for you, because Mumsnetters are incredibly educated people who really go out of their way to research a subject. And they're going to ask you a question about subsection C on page 7 of some bill you're sponsoring. They do not actually want to know about your biscuit.
I didn't watch them, but I think that until it came to the "what is a woman" question, then I started paying attention, and not just politicians, but lots of other people made total and utter fools of themselves. Or, for example, Girl Guiding were meant to have an Ask Me Anything conversation, someone from Girl Guiding, and they ended up pulling out because every question was, why are you basically allowing the boys who say they're girls into Girl Guiding? And they said it had been hijacked. But I mean, it's not hijacked. It's what your audience asked. So anyone who condescends, as Sarah says, is going to be absolutely crucified there. But more than that, anyone who tries to control the message in a sort of a corporate way is not going to do well there. You have to be sincere. And then the other thing that I would say is that everybody really does underestimate and condescend to mothers. It's extraordinary. I mean, most of the people that we're speaking to are mothers, in fact, but we don't think about that in the public place. But in Mumsnet, you remember that they're your mother. And people are so condescending to mothers. So anyone who goes in there talking down and not understanding that the questions about what's your favourite biscuit and that are in jokes, and thinks that, oh, it's there, pat, that person will wish they had never been born and will just go down like a lead balloon.
That's all from us this week. If you're not subscribed, you can do so below to never miss an episode. Thank you for joining, and catch you next week.